Yep.
I also wanted to give you this as a small token of
Oh,
appreciation.
thank you.
It's almond pound cake, so hopefully you don't
forget.
have any almond allergies.
No, perfect. Thank you so much. I love this. This is wonderful. Okay. All right. So have you been here all day? Is this a busy day? Yeah. You do all three services?
Yeah, I even had a 3 o'clock pastoral call. I thought I was going to get a nap in. Luckily, and he calls me. He's like, "All right, fine." So he's like, "Oh, I'm not feeling well. Is that okay?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah, it's fine."
Yeah.
So I crashed out for about 90 minutes.
Good evening, everyone.
All right.
Good evening.
Don't drink too much.
And we'll get underway in just a second. There's no last call,
Ah,
just to be clear. But I am going to pull the screen down. Not because we don't love you a lot and are deeply grateful. This feels weird. The hook. What's that? No, just going to do the screen. Yeah, just the screen. It's still weird though, right? Wave goodbye. They're not going. They still love you.
Can I get you put a time on? I'll tell them.
Welcome. Welcome. I'm Reverend Mike D'Angelo. It is a pleasure to be with you, a privilege to be with you. Before I welcome and introduce our speaker tonight, I want to say a few words of thanks. Debbie Mills, will you come forward? Debbie. The History Project of Church of the Redeemer, in honor of the 140th anniversary, owes its entire life to Debbie Mills. Debbie has been the driving force, the fuel in the tank, the cylinders of the engine, the oil in the engine, cooling fluid. I could go on in this metaphor for a while. Thanks to Debbie and thanks to James Perry, we are so indebted to you as a parish for reviving our sense of history, for correcting some of our misconceptions about our past, but also helping us set a faithful future, for having looked at and continuing to look at those who founded the parish and those who kept the legacy of faith alive. Debbie, on behalf of this grateful congregation, a round of applause would be thanks, please. If I could invite her history team to stand with her for a moment. You're on the history team. Stand on up. Liz,
all right.
Tonight we begin our year-long journey of celebration and exploration into the history of this remarkable parish. But tonight we welcome Mr. Kevin Levin. Kevin is a Boston-based historian now, previously from D.C. He is an educator, a widely read voice on how Americans remembered the Civil War. Kevin is the author of Remembering the Battle of the Crater, War as Murder, and Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's most persistent myth. Works that probe not just what happened between 1861 and 1865, but how the nation has argued over that past ever since. He's just completed a book to be published in 2026, the title of which...
Who knows?
You don't know yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know who it's about.
Robert Gould Shaw.
Yeah.
What's that? Robert Gould Shaw. Yes. So we look forward to the publication in 2026. Kevin founded the long-running Civil War Memory Platform and writes frequently for public audiences on monuments, on myth-making, and the work of historical truth-telling. On our parish's 140th anniversary, Kevin will begin our journey and help guide us into the post-Civil War ethos, the stories communities chose to tell, the silences they kept, and the ways memory can either heal or harden division. The scholarship of contested narratives and commemoration equips us to think Christianly about truth, reconciliation, and civic friendship in a polarized age. Please join me in a warm round of applause and redeem a welcome, Mr. Kevin Levin.
So was this,
That just records and that amplifies.
so I'm using this.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. The first thing I want to say is I apologize. I hate being between you and the drinks. So if you really need to, I don't have any problem if you just want to slip a hand under. It's very casual tonight. But I want to thank Debbie Mills and Reverend D'Angelo for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about a subject that I spend most of my waking hours thinking about, talking about, writing about especially. And when we talked a couple weeks ago online, we were talking about this journey that you're about to take. And I was just truly fascinated by this because, of course, you're setting out on exploring your community's past. And obviously, that comes with a lot of questions. It's going to come with a lot of surprises, perhaps some confusion, perhaps some angst of various sorts, depending on what you find during this journey. And I think that's so important to do right now, especially. I mean, right now, across this country, institutions, communities are doing this very hard work of coming to terms with some extremely difficult and fraught history. And if you are paying any attention right now to the news, you know that this country as a whole is engaged in this, dare I say, conversation, although I'm not quite sure that we can really call it a conversation at times, unfortunately. But that speaks to the challenges, that speaks to decades of what I would argue has been some blatant myth-making in this country. How Americans prefer to see themselves today in the present is very much tied to how we choose, how we prefer to see ourselves in the past. What is our collective history? What is our collective memory? And so I'm going to come back to this throughout this presentation, especially at the end. I want to say at the outset that my goal tonight is not in any way to be political with you. Although in a conversation like this, it can be difficult not to, at times, wade into some of this. And so I see my job primarily as a historian here. I think I was brought in to perhaps give you a sense of the skills that it might take to begin this conversation, some of the questions you might ask, to think of what you're doing this year, this coming year, as part of a much larger conversation, that you are not in isolation, that the kinds of history, the kinds of questions that you're going to engage with are the kinds of issues and questions that we have been struggling throughout this country over the last few years, especially the last 20 years. Now, I am a historian of the 19th century, and I am a historian specifically of the Civil War era with a very deep interest in memory regarding the Civil War. And that is certainly something that we as Americans are debating about right now. What is the legacy of the Civil War? Why do we still have a need to talk about it? What does it mean in 2025? What kinds of stories should we be telling about this part of our history? Why does it continue to resonate, even in places like Boston? Even in places like Boston, as you will see tonight. So what I'm going to do is, I don't have a prepared text to deliver to you. I don't want to lecture at you, not on Sunday night, that's for sure. I do have some slides that I want to share, some images. We'll have plenty of time, and actually I should ask, how much time do I have, by the way? Because if you let me go, we'll be here till tomorrow.
Go for it.
That, and we have time for questions after that? Okay, I think I'll try to hold back from an hour. That's a lot, but we'll see how it goes. Since we'll have time at the end, perhaps hold off if you can with a question or a comment, but if you feel really strongly about something, have at it, okay? I'm a former high school teacher. I can handle this, right? So whatever you got, right? We can do this. So there's no sort of strict guidelines here. And so let me get started here. Just before, I don't really have much to say about this image, but it is a local image, and most people have really no reference. Oh. Sorry about that. Anyone know what this is? This is what's called the Peace Jubilee. It was actually called a tent. It doesn't look like a tent, but that's what they referred to it. It was actually located pretty much in the area around Copley Square in 1869. It was called the Peace Jubilee. And I came here a little bit early tonight, and I heard the choir. There were probably somewhere around 2,000 choir members on a given night, and singers, in this hall. It held somewhere around 20,000 people. It was located, again, the area right around Copley Square in 1869, and it was set up specifically to commemorate the Civil War. And so even in Boston, in the immediate years after the war, Bostonians, like a lot of other Americans across the country, including, of course, the South, have a very, an obvious reason to commemorate and remember and make meaning of what had just taken place. So tonight, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about monuments, because a lot of what we're debating about in this country right now is about monuments. And monuments are a great way to dig into the issue of memory, because monuments are, in large part, narratives about memory. And when we look at monuments, as we'll sort of discuss tonight, we want to think about who put these up. What messages were they intended to send? Why do people today, all these years later, have problems with them? Why have so many in the last decade come down? What does it tell us about how we've chosen to remember this past, this American past? Now, before we can get to that, I have one little piece of sort of intellectual lifting, if you will, and it's a distinction that I think is always important to keep in mind when thinking about not just this subject of monuments and memory, but the work that you're going to do over the next year, the journey that you're going to take. Now, this is a passage from my favorite historian, a historian who teaches at Yale named David Blight. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today without his scholarship. And Blight says, memory is often owned, history interpreted, Memory is passed down through generations. History is revised. Memory often coalesces in objects, sites, and monuments. History seeks to understand context in all their complexity. History asserts the authority of academic training and canons of evidence. Memory carries the often more immediate authority of community membership and experience. So we're going to be spending most of our time tonight talking about the memory side of this equation, but I hope you have a sense of that distinction, that when we're doing history, we're trying to be critical of the past, we're interrogating evidence, we're doing our research, we're trying to make sense of the documents that we have available. Memory is more about storytelling. Memory is more about passing stories down from one generation to the next. Memory is about whose stories we choose to tell, and as a result, whose stories fall through the cracks. Every act of public remembrance, whether it's through a monument, the declaration of a national holiday, whatever you want to fill that in with, every act of remembrance involves an act of forgetting. And so when you're thinking about the history of this place, of this community, you can certainly go to some history books right now. You can find plenty of information. What has not been recorded? Whose stories? First of all, who did those? Who authored those histories? When were they written and published? Who published them? Who did they choose to talk about? And perhaps this comes, I think, closer to where many of you might want to go in the next year. What stories do we have a moral responsibility to record and find some way to honor? That I see as a big chunk of your job over the next year. And that, I think, is what connects you to communities across this country right now that are doing some really hard digging and trying to come to terms with why so many stories that seem to us today to be so central to this country's history. And right now, of course, I'll just throw it out there, we are talking about the history of American slavery. That is a lot of what the work that's being done is focusing on right now. Why have we failed to address this history in an honest and a more complete way? So in the first few years after the Civil War, memory was about honoring the dead, just coming to terms with the dead. Communities across the country, North and South, Confederate and Union, send these young men off to war by regiment, 1,000 men in these communities. They're all raised together in local communities. They all go off to war together. And if a regiment of 1,000 men is in the wrong place at the wrong time at a battle like Gettysburg or Antietam, by the end of the war, there may not be anyone left. But men with limbs missing, psychological trauma. And so coming to terms with the scale of death is the most immediate focus for communities, including Boston. This is a sketch of Brooklyn, but I'll show you right now just one example of many. That includes my trusty research assistant, Otis. This is Mount Calvary Cemetery over in Roslindale, where I live. Here's a Civil War cemetery. They're all over this area. You can see the headstones, clearly Civil War, 2nd Mass Cavalry, right here. These are the men who did not come back in one piece. Came back, of course, to be buried with their comrades. And so memory in places like Boston is simply about honoring the dead. In the South, in the former Confederate states, it's much worse. The scale of death is much worse. I'm not quite sure what Otis is doing there, but seems to be happy. here in Boston, very quickly, monuments begin to go up. Now this one is probably the most important one in downtown Boston. This is right in the middle of Boston Common. Now if you think of Boston Common and Civil War monuments, you're probably thinking of a monument that I'll show you in a few minutes, the one to the 54th Massachusetts with Robert Gould Shaw on horseback, and of course his soldiers following along. But this is the first one. This is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, dedicated in 1877. There were probably somewhere around 25,000 people in attendance for this dedication. It was a major event, and the scale of it, of course, gives you a sense of how important this early memory making is in places like Boston. But what I want you to focus on is the inscription, which I'm sure you can't read, but I can read it here. The inscription in gold leaf, says the following: "To the men of Boston who died for their country on land and sea in the war, which kept the Union whole, destroyed slavery, and maintained the Constitution, this grateful city has built this monument that their example may speak to coming generations." Now, most northern monuments that are dedicated roughly between 1870 and 1920 focus only on Union. Very few northern monuments focus on slavery and emancipation. So Boston, almost from the beginning of its public commemoration, begins to recognize that the war was about the issue of slavery, and that emancipation was an important result of the war. 4 million enslaved people are freed by 1865. That is something that we have lost, really, we have almost completely, I would argue, lost sight of in terms of its importance. In 1861, 4 million enslaved people are worth more than all of the material assets, banking assets, manufacturing in the entire country put together. No one would have anticipated the end of slavery in 4 years. No one. In fact, the war could have ended without slavery being abolished. If the war had ended before the end of 1862, there's no Emancipation Proclamation for Lincoln to sign, and everything that he had hoped to achieve in this war, namely the preservation of the Union, which is what the vast majority of the loyal white citizenry were fighting for, that itself would have been enough. Everything that they hoped to achieve would have been complete. But the war continued. And as the war dragged on, slavery becomes part of the cost. And Boston, in a way, takes the lead on this, as I just mentioned. And it will continue to do so in the years that follow. In the public garden, you can find some wonderful examples of this, what we might call emancipationist memory of the war, a memory of the war that is focused on the issue of slavery and emancipation. Charles Sumner, famous radical Republican, who from a very early age, well before the start of the Civil War, is advocating for the end of slavery. He gets caned over the head in 1855 for giving an anti-slavery speech in the Senate by a Southern representative, House member. So there's Sumner. Now notice, of course, in Boston, you only need the last name, right? In Richmond, it's the same with Lee. All you need are 3 letters, and you know who you're talking about. So this one is 1878. Keep the dates in mind here. Think about when this parish gets started. We're getting close to it, I think, if I have just a few years. Very controversial. This one just a few years later. Now the original one, this is a copy, went up in DC's Lincoln Park in 1876 on the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. It says emancipation, Lincoln holding perhaps a copy of the proclamation. Anyone see anything problematic about this statue? Now, it's the first time in American history when an African American is actually depicted on a monument. This monument, or the original one, was paid for by former slaves across the country. Pennies collected across the country. Started by a woman named Charlotte Scott, lived in Ohio. The sculptor was a man by the name of Thomas Ball, who lived across the Charles River in Charlestown. So that's why we had a copy here in Boston, in Park Square, starting in 1879. But as you can see, of course, it's incredibly problematic. Now, this is actually a revised version, because the original one, someone said, you know, it really looks like he's just kneeling in front of Lincoln. Well, to our eyes, it doesn't look much better than what that first version must have looked like. It still looks as though, obviously, Lincoln is the one sort of gesturing for him to rise and take his freedom, rather than, as Ball hoped to portray, an enslaved man rising on his own. But to our eyes in the 21st century, and even long before, Frederick Douglass gave the dedication address for this statue in DC in 1876, and even he noticed a problem at that time, but he let it go. We're going to come back to this a little bit later, but take a look at it. This is how Boston is now choosing to represent slavery, right? Where are the roughly 180,000 African Americans who fought in the United States Army to save the Union and end slavery? Where are the men who volunteered to fight for the 54th Massachusetts in this very city? They're not there yet. So what is being remembered? How is it being remembered? And as a result, what is being forgotten? And already, not just being forgotten, mythologized. What purpose does that serve? Who benefits from that? All of these are questions that people who study memory want some answers to, want to understand. And there's our guy, there's William Lloyd Garrison. If you're going to commemorate people who are at the forefront of the end of slavery in this country, you've got to have Garrison. The editor of the famous Liberator, started in 1831 here in Boston, one of the most vocal abolitionists of the entire pre-Civil War period. No one was more vocal. No compromise with enslavers. Garrison at one point burns a copy of the Constitution. It's a covenant with hell, he argues. So we're talking about someone who is absolutely committed to the end of slavery. And so, of course, on Commonwealth Avenue, it seems fitting to have a statue to Garrison. Wendell Phillips, one of my favorites. You can see, if you look closely, you can see the severed chain that he's holding. Phillips would refuse to wear anything made out of Southern cotton, right? I'm sure he walked around itching quite a bit. But on the reverse side of the monument or the statue, you can read the inscription, really a beautiful inscription. So again, all of these people are really well known in the pre-Civil War period. It seems fitting to honor them in such public spaces. And we've already sort of passed the point where this community has its beginning. And I was sort of reviewing a presentation that Debbie sent to me last week, just so I would know some of the things you've been talking about already. And of course, the founders of this community, they are the very same people who are putting up these statues downtown. The elite Bostonian families, the Gardners, the Lowells, the Putnams, the Cabots. They're all intermarried, they're all interconnected. Most of these families have made their fortunes well before the start of the Civil War, and many of them, either directly or indirectly, as a result of the slave trade. There's no question about that. If you are in the international shipping business, you are in some way connected to that larger story. And yet many of these families do produce men like this. So it's complicated. And then finally, William Ellery Channing, Unitarian minister, central to the Transcendentalist movement. He's calling for disunion well before 1861. He hates the Southern slaveholders so much that Channing just says, I think as early as like 1850, just let them go. Who wants a union with slaveholders? It's an immoral union. Let them go. So these are some of the most vocal proponents of the end of slavery. Garrison is not just pushing for the end of slavery. Garrison believes in equal rights. I mean, this is really unheard of in the 19th century. There are a handful of white Americans who are calling for equal rights. John Brown is an example. John Brown would sit at the same dinner table as African Americans. Most abolitionists, even in this city, want nothing personal to do with African Americans. They will interact with them, pushing for this issue of the end of slavery, but social settings, So there's a great distance between them. So again, it's all very complicated, but at the same time, there's something quite obvious about honoring these men in such public spaces, given who's doing the honoring. The elite Brahmin class of Boston, the Gardners, the Lowells, and so on and so forth. These are the people they know. These are the people they respect. These are the people that represent themselves. But remember what I said. For every act of public memory, there is also the act of forgetting. And Boston has done a good amount of forgetting. Because Boston, in the years leading up to the Civil War, was one of the most important centers of black abolitionism. The most important black leaders lived on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And you can visit the center of their community today. And if you haven't been there, it is my favorite, of all the historic places to visit in Boston, in downtown Boston, there's no site that comes close to the African Meeting House and the Abiel Smith School on Joy Street, just a few blocks from Beacon Street and the Boston Common. It's off the African American Historical Trail. The African Meeting House was the cultural and political center and religious center of Black Boston on Beacon Hill, and the Abiel Smith School was the first black public school in this country. And they're both wonderfully preserved. And very few people who come here will ever set foot. Why? Because after World War II, Boston decided that its Freedom Trail would start at the Capitol building at the State House and wind its way down along Tremont Street, past King's Chapel, past the Boston Massacre, down to Faneuil Hall, and cross the Charles River to the Naval Yard. And it misses entirely that brick path that you follow. Think about how important that is in guiding us, in saying to visitors, this is Boston's history. Follow this trail. It can't be any easier. But so much is missing. So if you ever have a chance to get down there, you get to walk right by Lewis Hayden's home. Lewis and Harriet Hayden were escaped slaves from Kentucky. And in their home, they harbored scores of fugitive slaves from the South. William and Ellen Craft, who escaped from Georgia in the late 1840s, Ellen was so fair-skinned she could pass for a white person. And her husband followed her as her servant by train, by boat, through New York, Philly, and eventually here to Boston. And they stayed in Hayden's home. fugitive slave catchers were so fearful of going into that home because the rumors were that right at the entrance, the Haydens actually placed explosives that they would set off if anyone tried to break in. William Cooper Nell, David Walker, who writes one of the most important abolitionist tracts in the late 1820s. All of these people, Maria Stewart, men and women, they are harboring fugitive slaves. They are pushing for the desegregation of public schools in the 1850s. Streetcars, all of this work on top of pushing for the end of slavery. Speaking in places like Tremont Temple, and quite often, as this illustration depicts, getting beaten up as a result. I mean, Frederick Douglass speaks at Tremont any number of times, and pretty much every time gets tossed around, although he was a pretty big guy. He could certainly take care of himself. But here's the question. There is not, or I should not, it's not really a question, it's more just a statement. There's not a single reminder of anyone on the Boston Common or in the public garden. Now that's not to sort of condemn the people who put these statues up or anything. They are very much products of their time. But now the question is for us today in 2025, how do we feel about that? What are our responsibilities once we come into that knowledge that these public spaces, so visible, are places with gaping absences, gaping holes, not just in the historical record, but a landscape that has the potential to bring us together. And that is ultimately what communities are after when they do this work of remembering. Can we create new narratives where everyone is represented? Everyone finds a home. Everyone feels as if they matter, that their stories matter, their histories, and as a result, it's not just about a dead past. It's about the moment now, and it's about how we move together into the future as a community. Who's here? And who do we want to welcome? And how do we do that? History is a way of doing that. I've always believed, and especially when I was a teacher with my high school students, it's not a dead past. We are all, the moment we are born, products of a past that we had no control over, except, of course, what we know about it, or choose to know about it, and have that influence us. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to do that work in our own way. Now, we do have the most important reminder in this country of African American participation in the war, the most important work of the war, fighting in the US Army for union, for the end of slavery. And I assume most of you have seen this monument. It is the most important piece of Civil War, public Civil War art in this country. Now, maybe the Lincoln Memorial is more important. I'll give you that. But most people actually don't even consider the Lincoln Memorial to be a Civil War, a product of Civil War memory. And that's because of everything that has taken place at the Lincoln Memorial since its dedication in 1924. But the Lincoln Memorial is a celebration of union. Not of emancipation, but of union. Please.
Stone Mountain in Georgia.
Stone Mountain, of course. I don't have an image of Stone Mountain, but I'm going to get to Confederate monuments in a second, and I'll mention Stone Mountain. Thank you for bringing that up. How many of you have seen it up close? Yeah. It is, I mean, I did most of my writing and research at the Boston Athenaeum, and I walk by this every day. And you know, I just finished a book about this man, and that monument inspires me every time I walk by it. It is the most realistic portrayal of African Americans from the Civil War that we have. I should say there are some contenders now, but this one, after its dedication, was the only one. And think about when it was dedicated, we're talking about a time when in popular culture, depictions of African Americans were typically they were caricatured, dehumanized. What you have here are men marching as men. And that's because Augustus St. Gaudens, the sculptor, made sure of that. He actually welcomed black men into his studio in New York City to pose for him. The stories are, of course, that many of these men were very suspicious. You can imagine, white man in New York City says, hey, why don't you come up and pose for me for my sculpture, right? It's gonna be amazing. Yeah, sure, I'll come right up. But he gets all of the detail right. He throws water on horses so he can actually get the bone, the exact structure, anatomical structure of the horse. All of the accoutrements that the men are carrying. But most of all, it's just the fact that it's the first black regiment raised in the North in 1863. It's the fact that the man riding that horse leads these men in a famous charge on July 18th, 1863, outside of Charleston, South Carolina, a charge that cost him his life. And on top of that, to reiterate, it's the only reminder in the entire country in 1897 that African American men fought in this war. And it won't be until 1998 that another monument will be dedicated, interestingly enough, in the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from Howard University. So it's a remarkable piece of public art, and if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend. As for African Americans in the South, a very different situation, because there are no monuments to their service in the U.S. Army. Thousands of former slaves fight in the U.S. Army. Most of the black men who fight in the U.S. Army in the Civil War are from Confederate states, formerly enslaved men. Even as late as 1903, they are still marching, they are still celebrating their preferred memory of the war. African Americans refuse to forget, even in the former capital of the Confederacy. Here they're marching down Broad Street, just a block from the former Confederate capital in Richmond. And I love this photograph. It's one of my favorites because you can see at least 3 generations of African Americans marching down this main drag. You can see, of course, probably veterans of the war, their children, and then, of course, you can see the grandchildren, the future of Black Richmond. And these kinds of scenes play out all over the South. African Americans remember, but they don't have monuments. So if you look at this graph, I don't want to make too much of it, but if you've been following the monument debate, all the Confederate monuments that have come down in the last 10, 15 years went up roughly between 1890 and 1920, 1930. Somewhere around 300 of them have come down over the last 15 years. But this is the period in which they all go up. You can see another spike here. This is the 1950s. But this is not monuments. These are the names of schools that are changed to, or given at their dedication, names of Confederate generals. Now, why would that happen in the mid-1950s? Schools honoring Confederate generals. Anyone want to?
Segregation.
Yes, it is all in response to Brown v. Board of Ed. So this becomes a form of what you might call massive resistance against federal intervention in the South. I'll show you this real fast and then I'll move on. But just to make this point, this is the post-war South. And if you look at the sort of the color coding here, the circles all represent Confederate monuments. And basically what I want you to notice is that this color, the light pink, notice where the light pink is, right? These are places where African Americans are disfranchised by state constitutions. So if you look at these dates, all of these states revised their state constitutions during that year. So why are they doing that? Because they want to ensure that African Americans don't take part in the political process. So you have a 15th Amendment, you have the right to vote in this country, but South Carolina might say, you can vote in South Carolina as long as you pay a poll tax, as long as you can pass a literacy test. Some states have clauses that say, you ready for this? Well, they're called grandfather clauses. You can vote in the state as long as your grandfather was not enslaved in 1860. Now, how many African Americans in the South can claim that? These are all perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. The brown areas are counties where more than half of the population was African American. Now, why is that important? Look at how many circles are in those brown areas. That means Confederate monuments are going up in counties throughout the South where more than half of the population holds a different memory of the war than they do. And why are they getting their monuments? Because they have no political power, right? They are disfranchised. They are cut off from any lever of being able to engage in conversations about what might represent their own preferred history, memory of the past. So what goes up in these places? Monuments like this in Augusta, Georgia, where the inscription reads, "No nation rose so white," so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime. Very explicit. The racism is always explicit in these monuments. Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's been removed. One of the largest slave traders in Memphis before the war, a Confederate general responsible for one of the worst racial massacres in the entire Civil War. And if that wasn't enough, leader of the Klan after the Civil War for a brief period. The most important one of all, Robert E. Lee, 1890. 150,000 people may have been in attendance at this dedication. This is the one where it's just 3 letters on the monument, L-E-E. Everyone knows who it is. And if you control the memory, you also control other people's memory of the war. So it's not just that African Americans don't have an opportunity to dedicate their own monuments. White Southerners are dedicating their own monuments about them. So remember the 54th Massachusetts defiantly marching? In Fort Mill, South Carolina, we have a statue or monument dedicated to the faithful slaves who, loyal to the sacred trust, toiled for the support of the army with matchless devotion and with sterling fidelity. African Americans never wanted to be free. They were perfectly content with slavery. They were loyal to their masters, and they were loyal to the Confederacy. So notice how memory is working here in a very similar way to what happened in the public garden. We don't maybe want to think about that connection, but the people in control chose a specific kind of landscape. In the public garden, it's a landscape of white abolitionists. There are no black figures in the public garden. And if you count the Shaw Memorial, you can, but those men are soldiers. A very different kind of monument. Former Confederates and the next generation are also controlling the landscape. They're controlling whose stories get told and how. And then there is Arlington National Cemetery. A cemetery, the first national cemetery, established in 1864 for the Union dead. This was Robert E. Lee's former home. It wasn't really his, it was his wife's. But he lived there part of the time, and then left in 1861 after it was occupied. And in 1914, the United Daughters of the Confederacy dedicated what was, and what could soon be again, the largest monument in the entire cemetery. It sits at the center of roughly 360 Confederate graves. This is all by permission. President McKinley started it off in 1900, roughly. Woodrow Wilson gave the dedication speech for this monument. You can see the children running around. Monument dedications are always about the next generation, educating the next generation to continue to sort of remember, reinforce that memory. And it's been in the news lately because in 2023, in December, it was removed. Congress ordered its removal after a commission decided that military bases named after Confederates should be changed and that this monument should be removed. It may go back. President Trump has ordered that it be returned to Arlington. Here's a close-up. If you want to know why this is so controversial, take a look at the very center, or I should say center right. There is your Mammy figure. If you know the movie Gone with the Wind, think of Mammy. Mammy is the quintessential. She is the clearest representation of the loyal slave. Has no interest in freedom, wants nothing more than to take care of the children of this Confederate officer so that he can go off and fight to keep her enslaved. That's what this monument represents. And it may soon be ordered back, or I should say it's supposed to go back by 2027. We shall see. So that brings us back to today. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this man. I assume most of you, if not all of you, know who this is. He is really one of the main reasons why we are talking about this subject today, why Americans across the country are talking about it. This is Dylan Roof, and on June 21st, 2015, he walked into a historic black church in downtown Charleston, went into the basement, sat in a Bible study for an hour with 11 people, and after an hour, got up and shot at point-blank range 9. Including Clementa Pinckney, Reverend and state senator, who Barack Obama, of course, eulogized when he gave his address shortly thereafter. Now, this would not have started a conversation about memory and history, but for the fact that a couple days later, newspapers around the country ran photographs like this. I was in Germany at the time with my wife, and I still remember opening German papers. They were all over the place. But of course, this specific image is what served as the catalyst, because it served as a clear reminder of the unfinished work that still needed to be done to come to terms with this history. And since 2015, that is what communities across the country have been doing. You can look at, for example, as I mentioned, hundreds of Confederate monuments have come down. Most of them have come down peacefully as a result of local commissions doing their work, holding public meetings, voting by city council. The vast majority have come down that way. Some have been pulled down by activists, including at UNC Chapel Hill, where this soldier statue, Confederate statue, known as Silent Sam, had stood since roughly 1913. And you can see violently pulled down. That is not blood, that is red paint that students have been throwing on this statue in the weeks leading up to this. This is one of the most fascinating examples that I can share with you. This is St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond. This is a church that has long been known as the Church of the Confederacy. It's right in the center of Richmond, again, the former capital of the Confederacy. It's where Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis would go to church every Sunday. It's where Jefferson Davis was the Sunday he learned that Robert E. Lee's army was in full retreat toward Appomattox, where it would surrender about a week later. And this church, in the years after the Civil War, was one of the centers of a very vibrant public memory of the Confederacy because of its connection to Lee and Jackson. They put up a number of monuments, a number of markers, honoring various people from the Confederacy. But the crown jewels are these two Tiffany windows that went up, I think, in the early 20th century. And since 2015, actually I should say well before 2015, St. Paul's has been doing really hard work on coming to terms with this history. They are one of the national leaders on this. And it has been extremely challenging on a number of fronts. They have removed quite a bit, but when it came to these two Tiffany windows, they chose not to remove them. And instead what they did, and they did it quite effectively, I've seen it, they placed two very clear, prominently placed historical markers next to these windows, explaining in very explicit detail why they are there. Now, some people may disagree with the decision not to remove them. The National Cathedral in DC did remove a stained glass window, or maybe even two, that honored the Confederacy. But in Richmond, they chose not to. I'll leave that to you to judge, but their story is much larger than what you see here. But it is one really great example of how these communities are struggling and doing that hard work to come to terms with this stuff. Removing monuments. There is the Lee Monument. All of Richmond's Confederate monuments are gone. For me, as someone who used to live in Virginia and taught for 12 years, I used to bring my students every semester to these places and walk with them and help them understand what this is all about. It is still difficult for me to wrap my head around the fact that they're all gone. I understand why, but the absence still for my brain is difficult because they were wonderful teaching tools. Of course, I understand why they're gone. I absolutely understand why they're no longer there. Those are community decisions. That's also hard work for these communities to engage in, making these decisions. And here in Boston, there is your Emancipation Memorial, removed in 2020. Most of these monuments came down in the weeks and months after the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And this is what happened here in Boston. I was involved in the public discussions about whether to remove this. They were held online because of COVID. And I remember just people from all walks of life sharing their thoughts. I remember one African-American woman, she said, I have to walk by this monument every morning with my, I think her boy, her young child, I think he was like 8, 9 years old. And she said, every morning he looks up at this statue and he says to her, he asks, why does that man who looks like daddy kneeling in front of that white man? Another example from Boston. Many of you have probably heard of this, right? I mean, I've only been here since 2011 in Boston, but you know, every few months, every year at least, you hear about the Columbus statue, somebody throwing red paint on it, somebody cutting off its head, right? Doing some kind of damage to poor Christopher Columbus. And of course, it's downtown or it was downtown on the waterfront, close to the North End, the Italian neighborhood, and finally it was removed in 2020. And another place that you should all visit, if you want an example of a community that's doing the hard work, go visit the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Massachusetts. This is one of the most important sites of New England slavery that we have, and they do an amazing job. They don't just cover the history of slavery. The royal family was one of the largest slave-owning families in all of New England. They don't just cover this history. Their story is the story of the royal house. When you go through the royal house, the white family, they are the sideshow. So you actually are fully immersed in the experience of the enslaved who worked and lived perhaps in this building here. They're not exactly sure. But it's a wonderful place to visit, and it's a great, if you have questions about, you know, dealing with some of this history, they are always willing to talk about it. It's an incredible staff. I highly recommend it. And then there's Faneuil Hall. Should we change the name of Faneuil Hall? Now, Boston went through this discussion a couple years ago. I wrote and published an op-ed in the Boston Globe in which I argued that it probably should not be changed. I can go either way, actually. But I tried to make the case for keeping the name. But we have a wide range of views on this. Now, will this come up again? Should it come up again? Probably will. But it's another example of how Boston is dealing with some of this history. And then just a couple weeks ago, I don't know if you've read about this in the news, King's Chapel. I just drove by it a couple days ago. I haven't walked by it. They just unveiled, they haven't dedicated it yet, but they just unveiled this brand new statue of an enslaved woman. I don't know the exact symbolism. I haven't had time to really look into it. But it's, if you're facing King's Chapel, it's in the courtyard to the right. And it's basically, the intent here is to commemorate the enslaved people owned by the congregation. Because of course, you know, these families would bring their servants with them to church every weekend, and they would be forced to sit atop looking down, so in the balcony area. And so this community has been doing this work over the last few years, and they decided that dedicating a statue to the men and women who were present in this community as enslaved people but never acknowledged, this is their way of acknowledging them. And this is my final, really getting to the second to last slide here. This is an image that has been all over the news over the last few weeks. I want to end with this image. It's an incredibly difficult image to look at. There is a photograph. I decided not to use that. This image is in many museums across this country, many Smithsonian museums, and many National Park Service sites. And this is where I am going to get a tiny bit political. Because right now, National Park Service sites and Smithsonian sites are being told by this administration to remove this material. To remove material that it deems, at least the president deems, to be un-American, that shames this country, that makes people feel uncomfortable. And this is really the front line right now of where we are. As you begin to set out on this journey as a community to look at your own history, you have to essentially make that decision as to whether you're going to confront, fully confront, maybe stories that are upsetting, that are embarrassing, that you didn't know anything about before, and that might make you feel ashamed. My wife is from Germany. She knows the history of her country as well as I know the history of my country. And remember one of the first, we started dating, and after a couple of years of dragging her to historic sites and monuments, many of them Confederate when we lived in the South, she looked at me, I'll never forget it, and she said, "The problem with your country is you have no sense of collective shame." And I had no response to her. Now that doesn't mean Germany is perfect when it comes to dealing with its past. But one could make the argument that it has done much more in confronting the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust than we have done here dealing with some of this history. So I think without getting further into politics, we have to decide whether or not we're going to confront this and deal with it and make meaning of it and find ways to bring us together as a way of moving forward. And that, of course, is the most important work, finding ways to memorialize, finding narratives in our past, as I started out, that do have the potential to lead to common ground, to find ways to embrace one another, people perhaps that we have not fully embraced for whatever reason, either because we don't see them today or we never saw them in our past. And so I know this is a controversial monument, but I do like it. And whenever I'm downtown on the Boston Common, I walk by it because it does sort of give me hope. And with that, I'm going to stop because I think I might have talked too long. So I'd love to hear comments, questions. Thank you. Do we have time? Did I go on too long? Okay, good. I just want to make sure. I sometimes completely lose track of time. And there are still drinks if you need a drink.
If I may.
Oh, please.
As a former high school history teacher, I want to thank you.
My pleasure.
But I also, another round of applause for Kevin.
Oh.
For
Thank you.
I want to take a few minutes, if I can, to offer the microphone to folks
Yes.
in terms of questions. But before I do, I'm going to take the rector prerogative and ask the first question, if I may, which is, what happened in Boston? Boston had this remarkable moment when it decides to celebrate emancipation, and there seems to be a great and mighty positivity, and we know what the last 100 years or so of Boston's history around people of color has been, and what happened?
Yeah, if I had the answer to that question. It's a really good question, and I struggle with that all the time in trying to make sense of how memory and how we think about our collective past sort of ebbs and flows over time. And I think part of it, and this is sort of a way of dodging your question, but not entirely. I think that we have, and I think this can serve really important purposes. I think it can have a positive effect, but I think quite often it has the opposite. I think we have a tendency to embrace some form of American exceptionalism in this country. And what I mean by that is this belief, and Americans certainly in the 19th century believed that we were sort of God ordained, that we were somehow special as a people, as a nation, compared to every other nation around the world that has ever existed. That's American exceptionalism. And there is this, I think, deep belief, even if we don't sort of acknowledge it explicitly, that freedom in this country, that progress is somehow guaranteed. And I don't mind admitting that I've been really struggling with that in recent years for a number of reasons. And I think we do have, I think that a certain amount of humility is in order when we're sort of faced with a reasonable question like that. Because we are, I think many of us, for whatever reason, wondering what's going wrong, where are we right now as a nation, how can we get back on track? And so much of that assumes that there is, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I feel like I am at the moment, that assumes that there is a track that we were on, rather than dealing with the complexity of the many different forces that are at work in shaping our history and who we are as a nation.
Did you say a word about the death of Sumner?
So I think Sumner dies in I want to say 1873. So Sumner dies around the very same time that the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, dies. And there's a way of sort of drawing some importance from this because they were both hardcore radical Republicans. Andrew, not so much as compared to Sumner. There's a wonderful new biography of Charles Sumner that's out, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in this man. This is someone who was, as I suggested during the talk, deeply committed to the end of slavery and even equal rights. He actually partnered with, I think his name was Robert Morris, African-American, first lawyer, I think to get a degree from Harvard. But he's the one who actually, the two together are prosecuting the case to desegregate Boston's public schools. So he's deeply committed to these issues. The Republican Party after the war, and this is the Republican Party of the mid-19th century, is the party against slavery. The radical Republicans after the Civil War, during this period we call Reconstruction, are deeply committed to reconstructing the South around equal rights, around civil rights, the 14th Amendment, around the right to vote, the 15th Amendment. But what happens in this country during Reconstruction is a lot of the old Republicans begin to die off. There's Sumner. There's a significance in that. But the more significant part of this is the country moves on. Most Republicans are not old enough to really remember the debates of the 1850s. The country is moving in a very direction. What country is the country moving in? I'm sorry, what direction is the country moving in after the war? Where do you go after the war? West. West. That's what the Civil War is about anyway. The Civil War is about whether or not the future of this country, whether Western territories will be free states or slave states. The Civil War decides that. They will be free states. Most white Northerners were not fighting for equal rights in the Civil War. Robert Gould Shaw, who I just spent 5 years researching and writing about, I know a lot of people love to think of him as a sort of civil rights hero. He was not. He was deeply conflicted.
That's Matthew Broderick you're talking
That's Matthew Broderick. I know, and it breaks my heart as I'm reading his letters and thinking to myself, oh man, don't say that. He compares the heel sizes of African Americans in the 54th Massachusetts. Because why? Because Louis Agassiz over at Harvard believes that heel size dictates something about your moral character. Right? But that's Boston in the mid-19th century. So most Americans have moved on. Most Americans, the Union has been preserved. Slavery is over. Let the former Confederate states figure this out on their own. It's not as if the northern states were really that welcoming to African Americans. I mean, in the 1850s, if you're African American, you can't even live in the state of Illinois legally. You're not allowed. You can't vote in most northern states. Can't sit on juries. So the North isn't this haven. But of course, the North doesn't have slavery. That is, of course, the line. That is the line. And that was a significant one. I'm not trying to downplay that. It's absolutely significant. So that's my, yeah. Who else wants?
Questions?
Question. Even just a comment, anything.
Because I could go again.
Yeah, it's all yours.
Don't do that.
Go for it.
I heard you mention John Brown's name earlier in the
Yeah.
presentation. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on him and how he should be remembered, because I know it's complicated.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. John Brown is probably the most complicated figure from the 19th century, no question. And right now, just to sort of keep you focused on the situation when it comes to public history in this country, and the National Park Service and their challenge right now, Harper's Ferry has, they're on the firing line when it comes to the story they tell, because they've been told to actually take exhibits down about the history of slavery. I mean, think about that. Harper's Ferry only exists as a historic site because it's the site of John Brown's raid, which was to do what? To free people. So, sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but it just does give you a sense of how absurd some of this is. I think John Brown is, like I said, I think he is one of the most complicated. I think the tendency to see him as mentally unstable is a huge mistake. There is absolutely no evidence that John Brown was mentally imbalanced, that he had any kind of psychological problem that would sort of propel him to engage in an act like trying to make other people free. And whenever you're sort of confronted by someone who tries to make that claim, the response must be, but what is the institution of slavery itself but the most violent form of behavior, right, of labor that one can imagine? Slavery itself is a form of violence. Forget about whether or not we're talking about the kind of scarred back that I showed you just a few minutes ago. Just the act of holding someone enslaved is a form of violence. So I think Brown, when you put him in that context and see violence as not the exception in 19th century American history, but it's actually the norm. The 19th century, if you think about labor strikes and labor confrontations in the late 19th century, The 19th century, when I hear people today say that we have never been more divided than we are today, or that political violence has never been worse, I just want to say, does your memory not go any further back than a month? And that's not to downplay the kind of political division, what we've seen. I'm not trying to do that at all. But as a historian, right, when you look at the 19th century enough and you spend enough time in the 19th century, man, I can tell you, I would never want to live in the 19th century. So Brown sort of fits into that broader, I think that context of just this sort of deeply embedded violent culture that framed America, you know, again, throughout much of that century. And certainly, you know, I think has always been a debate over who controls his memory, right? Do we see Brown as someone who was a freedom fighter? If we do, what does that mean in terms of of the extent to which we are justifying violence as a means to securing rights in this country, freedoms in this country? Is Brown the pattern that we want to follow as Americans? What are the dangers in lionizing him in that regard? And then, of course, on the other hand, for a long time, Brown was, I don't want to say demonized, but mythologized by former Confederates in Harper's Ferry, because what happened in Harper's Ferry, and you can still see it, is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are responsible for all of the monuments, pretty much, that went up at the turn of the 20th century. Their most important work, however, was not monuments. I should just say, their most important work, and the reason why we are still in this country so, it's still so difficult to move beyond this sort of fantasy of the Confederacy. Some people call it the lost cause, this kind of, you know, we're going to think of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson as these great generals with great personalities and characters, fighting for their causes, you know, willing to sacrifice. I mean, this is a very seductive narrative, this sort of lost cause. But what the UDC did is they controlled the textbooks that schools used. They realized that if you want to win the war, you may have suffered military defeat. The Confederacy lost, but you can still win the memory war. And so they controlled textbooks throughout the country. So they had little guides, and it would say, reject a book to a school council board. They'll say, reject a book if it praises Lincoln. Reject a book if it slanders Jefferson Davis. All of these guidelines. But what they did with Brown in Harper's Ferry is they put up a monument to the one black man that was killed during the raid. In the middle of the night, on the first night of the raid, a porter on the railroad basically was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was shot by one of Brown's men, no one knows who. And after the war, the UDC chose to memorialize him with a large plaque that is still standing in Harper's Ferry. And so Brown has been sort of memorialized in so many different ways that there are so many different narratives of Brown that you can latch onto. And so his memory in this country is incredibly rich and complicated. Please. Do you want, should I give you this?
More of a comment than a question, I guess.
Oh,
but
sure.
I'm thinking about just the fact that all of these statues are bodies.
Uh-huh.
The white folks and black folks, and that the white folks are generally clothed and like very put together, and some of the black folks are, you know, maybe just wearing a loincloth or like acted upon, you know, like the one with all the whips on his back picture. And it just made me think about this idea of like being acted upon.
That's right.
And not being an agent.
Who has agency?
Yeah, and I guess my faith connection is how often Jesus is pictured as this broken body and being acted upon. So just a little comment about embodiment.
Thank you so much for that. I think about that all the time, and I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to many of these statues and monuments, the question that you want to ask is, who's telling the story in the monument, even if they're depicted there? So the man in the Lincoln Emancipation, that's actually based on a real man by the name of Archer Alexander, the black man kneeling. And we don't know much about him, but certainly he would not have been dressed in that way. But even at the time, it was controversial because, of course, for many African Americans, and there were thousands, pretty much all of Black Washington marched out to Lincoln Square for that dedication. And they were thrilled with it, for the most part. There's no doubt, there's no question. First, one of their own is being memorialized. African Americans, for the most part, viewed Lincoln as the quote-unquote great emancipator. Douglas had a much more complicated view of Lincoln, in part because of his own meetings with Lincoln in the White House. The entire federal government came out for that dedication. U.S. Grant was there, who was the president, the vice president, the entire Senate, the Supreme Court came out. And so Douglas, for him to give the dedication address, the next time in American history that an African American will address that large a body of the federal government is Barack Obama, all those years later. So you get a sense of its significance, but especially with the Arlington Monument and the Mammy figure, I mean, that's a figure that just courses right through the 20th century. When you think about the old syrup, Aunt Jemima, right? What role is she playing, right? And then, of course, the Mammy figure, which is the most popular. I mean, that is a deeply embedded representation, supposedly, of African-American women. And it's incredibly damaging. Because, of course, again, if you're arguing if the memorial is considered fact, then African-Americans then states are justified in 1914, and perhaps the country is justified, if it chooses to be, justified in relegating African Americans as second-class citizens. Because if they never wanted to be free, then that provides a historical justification for any present politics. And that's the danger. Because in 1914, you've got Woodrow Wilson giving the dedication address. When Woodrow Wilson comes to Washington for his first term, the Washington federal workforce is not segregated. The buildings aren't segregated. And even in some of the administrations, or administrative divisions, African Americans actually have some significant roles. They're playing the role of manager. They're actually able to move up through the ranks. All of that ends when Woodrow Wilson shows up. He's a Southerner. He's the first Southerner elected. So what's one of his first executive orders? To segregate the federal workforce. And so the black neighborhood, which is pretty much centered around Howard University, this so-called Shaw neighborhood, for decades, I mean, this is a neighborhood that suffers economically because the vast majority of African Americans in DC work for the federal government. So it's one of the reasons why DC blows up in the 1960s, in 1968 specifically, because of the economic downturn that has been long-standing up to that point. So it has a real direct impact. Like, these monuments are not passive. They are, someone once put it to me, they do certain work. And some of the most important work that these monuments do is justify how we choose to see the present. And that's the dangerous part. That's why it's so important to try to peel back. Whether we're talking about a monument, peel that back. Whether we're talking about the history that we read, what kinds of history books are we reading? What we're learning in school, right? All of these kinds of, the way we're consuming the past, right? Let's peel it back and see where it comes from. Who's writing it? From what perspective? What was their agenda when they wrote it? Right? When they made certain decisions, all of that.
Oh, I don't read that. I just wanted to add that I work with young children, and when you're talking about what they're learning, as many of us know, a lot of books are being banned
Yep.
that discuss
Yes.
slavery. And there is this false assumption that these children will feel guilty.
Yeah.
These white children will feel guilty. But when they are interviewed, these children identify as people who would help with the Underground Railroad. These children are not sitting there feeling guilty. They're sitting there
They're
saying,
engaged.
how can I help?
That's right. That's right.
hopeful.
Yeah. I've never had teaching at the high school level. I've never had the kind of interaction with a student that supposedly is going on if you listen to just our elected leaders.
Well, these children, by the way, are under the age of 7 or
Sure.
8.
Yeah, yeah.
Kevin, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. It's 7:30. No, I know. I know.
When to say no to me, so.
oh, I like this. Oh,
I love it.
it's like an encore.
Hi.
Please.
First of all, I just want to thank you for the brilliant presentation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm wondering if we could get a copy of it. I know you said you didn't do a lecture, but if
It's
being
actually
recorded-
being recorded at this
Right.
very moment, and after this, I will do a quick clip on either end, and I will put it up on our YouTube and our Facebook page.
Yes, great. So I just had some comments.
Provided Kevin provides me with 10,000 American dollars.
Over to you. I just want to say that we can't run away from the truth and history. And I feel as a nation to heal, we have got to face the past history and face the truth and let the new generation learn what happened in the past. Because history is the study of the present and the past, so we can project into the future. And I think, well, maybe it's a political statement, but I don't think so. If we try to say we want to erase everything because we don't want that burden on the children, no matter what happens, that burden exists and it is still going to weigh on them. So I just think that it's the job of historians, even though a different narrative has been sort of put out there with the various statues, but to peel it out and really tell the truth as it was for the nation to see and not be silenced. So I want to thank you for all the research and the work you've done to put this together.
Thank you for that comment. I can't add anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Officer.
Yeah, thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
On behalf of the History Committee, welcome and thank you again. If you think that the moment of our founding was an uncomplicated and idyllic moment in the nation's history, I hope you have been disavowed of that notion this evening. As complicated, as divided, as dramatic and violent an era, we are, thank God, far from that level of discord and violence.
Absolutely.
Our parish at that moment decided to come into being for the purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ and sought very keenly to offer a voice of hope and possibility in God's name in this area, in this town, in these towns, and particularly at 381 Hammond Street. As we move into the next weeks and months of considering this history, we will be together again on October 19th. Dr. Chris Evans, Professor Emeritus at Boston University, will be with us to talk about the theological trajectory of that optimism in the social gospel movement as it moved through Boston, as a countervailing idea of positivity and possibility. So I welcome you to that. We'll be here, we'll have evensong, and Chris will be with us as we continue to have this good conversation. The past is not our enemy. It is our teacher. And it is a teacher that speaks honestly if we're willing to hear her. And so I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I really, really want to thank Kevin for the conversations that we had in preparation for tonight, but also for this extraordinary presentation, the work that you've put in. I very much can't wait to read the Robert
Thank you.
Shaw biography.
Appreciate it.
Because he was part of his moment.
Absolutely.
And Matthew Broderick did a great job. It's not that. It's
I
not
hear you.
that.
I hear you.
Ferris Bueller it's just not working for me.
I know.
But again, we're so grateful for you, so grateful for your witness to history's complexity and our own need to wrestle. I hope and pray that we can continue to be a community that wrestles in a holy way, in a way of the collect today for this morning said God is known principally through mercy and pity.
Mercy is the most extraordinary thing we can offer one another, especially when discussions and divisions are amongst us. And pity is not a negative thing that we offer to the lesser. It is that gift that we offer to our beloved brothers and sisters in Christ. And so may this be our guiding, our lodestone in the midst of all of these difficult days that are still yet ahead, but God be with us, as God has always been. The Lord be with you. Gracious, loving, and living God, thank you for history. Thank you for the story that we can tell. Thank you for conscience that guides us in our telling of it, our willingness to wrestle, our willingness to listen, our willingness to speak. May we hold one another in the midst of this divided time as our ancestors in faith held one another in theirs. Guide us, Holy One, into all righteousness. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you all so much. If we could just ask your help in gathering up empties, bringing them to the counter, we'll make sure that things get cleared up, cleaned up, and all the rest. And Susie, a round of applause to Susie for being our bartender. Thank you so much, friends.
Whew. All right. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, appreciate it.
I hope you'll come back.
Oh, I would love to.
Okay,
I would
good.
love to.
I wanted to have a private word because what I have to say probably would not go down well.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was born and raised in the South.
Yeah, where?
So, well, not born there, raised there by Southern parents.
Where?
I lived in Alexandria,